Well, I just wrapped up The Last Jedi, and I'm not going to bash it the way people have. I'm going to instead point to things that either could have fixed it, or could have, or that are actually good moments of this movie, because I don't think this is a bad movie, and I don't think that a lot of the hate comes from the fact that this was just the second installment of this film, or of this trilogy, and a lot of people hated it because something I hated it was felt like a more self-contained standalone type film, and that it didn't leave enough for episode 9 to actually touch on a lot of stuff. It kind of wrapped everything up with just very little to go off of, besides just rebuilding the rebellion, or the resistance, I guess is what it would be called. But so with that being said, I'm gonna focus in on, but start with what was the message of this movie. I believe that it is the past is important to remember, but is not a guideline for what tomorrow is supposed to be. Who you are, or who your family is, or what they've done isn't important. Only you are. You can see that message is shown throughout the time of Rey just trying to find out who she is. Or whenever she gets down in that little dark cave and she looks into the mirror, it's only herself, because that to me was telling, don't worry about who your family is. Don't worry about what the crimes that they might have done, or who they are, what like trying to find your place in life. Just find your place because of who you are. Don't worry and don't harp on who those people that came before you are that you're related to. And I do think that that's a very powerful message, and something that we need to know nowadays, rather than just assume that the past is always going to come back to repeat itself, because yes, it is, but that's only if you harp on it so much, in my opinion. Not just knowing it, but trying to, you're going to constantly be repeating it because that's all you're focused in on. I think that the way that BB-8 handles fixing post-canons at the beginning of the movie against the Dreadnought was kind of something that was foreshadowing the rest of the film. He plugs in one port and another sparks up, and you just see it continually going, that sparks just keep coming up. So it's like one problem is fixed, but here's another, here's another. You fix one, here comes another. And then at the end of it, it's just him banging his head against it. And that's kind of what happens at the end. There is another bit of foreshadowing later on that I'll touch on, or actually I can just touch on now, when Leia is force traveling through space and she breaks through the hologram of the Star Destroyer. It's the exact thing that Holdo does. And I feel that those two moments, if you look at the way BB-8 solves the fixing of the cannons and the way Leia just comes through, it kind of speaks on just the entire film as a whole and how it's going to play out if you actually focused in on it. One thing a lot of people were saying was, how does bombs fall in space? Obviously there's no gravity, so how does it? But each ship has its own artificial gravity, and these bombs that are on it are being pulled and yanked down through space, and like the Newton's law of gravity states, an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted upon. So there's nothing pushing against them, so they're going to just constantly be falling in that motion. So the bombs falling isn't a problem, so please stop using it as a problem. It is not a problem. There's science behind it, and this is a science fiction film, so there are science meanings or reasoning behind this stuff. So I'll move on. The reason Luke doesn't know who Rey really is because he broke himself off from the Force, and again that is shown in the way that Rey says that when she was trying to feel through the Force, and she was talking, and she was describing what she was saying, but she couldn't see Luke, and says that she closed herself off. So in the next film, this is a kind of spoiler, the reason he says that he might have always known, or Leia always knew who her parents really were but didn't care about it, was Luke knew it at that moment whenever he connected back with Leia, that who her family really was, because he was back connected to the Force. He was sensing what Leia, he was sensing who Rey was. So in essence, that's kind of where he learned who she really was. And I believe it's right after that where she goes and, or where Luke goes and finds Rey and Kylo just sitting in the hut together, and that's why he's so mad at that moment, is because he knows who she really is. And it just kind of drives home for that. And a lot of people said, how does Leia be able to force walk and be able to force travel through it, but there's no evidence showing that she is force sensitive or she's had training. But she does, and it's shown in episode 5. It is shown whenever Luke talks to her and she knows where he is. And in episode 6, whenever she's talking to Han about whenever Luke blows up the Death Star and he says, I'm sure Luke wasn't on it, and she's like, I know he wasn't. How would you think that she knows it if she wasn't force sensitive? In episode 7, when Han dies, you see her kind of fall back a little bit, heartbroken, kind of like Obi-Wan was in episode 4 when Alderaan was destroyed. So she was connected to Han. If she wasn't force sensitive, she wouldn't have felt that moment. And then just constantly in this movie, she is shown using the Force very minutely, but it is shown that she is connected to other people and thinking and being able to see what other people are kind of seeing. The Canto Bight scene, the casino scene that a lot of people hated, I think that the reason they hated it wasn't because of that it was a scene in this movie. It did kind of feel out of place for a Star Wars movie. However, I think that you could fix that by just taking out Rose out of that entire sequence of them on Canto Bight, because not because I don't like her as a character or that I think she's useless as a character. I just think that Poe needs to be there on Canto Bight to learn what she's trying to teach Finn, when Finn learned that war is bad and all this stuff in episode 7. So he's literally just repeating his own story arc from episode 7 and episode 8, which is why in the last video I said I think Rian Johnson was just going with this off of, didn't really watch episode 7. Like, he knew kind of what happened and stuff like that, but I don't think he studied and where he was trying, or J.J. Abrams left it to continue the story. One last thing I would like to touch on is when Kylo Ren breaks his mask. It is kind of telling about his whole story arc as a whole. He has that mask to hide himself away, even though he doesn't need it, and even though when he's on the bridge with Han in episode 7, he's saying, your son was weak, or your son was foolish, or weak and foolish like his father, so I killed him. So he's taking ownership that Ben was completely dead, so Kylo Ren was that mask. But then you see him break it, or then whenever he takes it and he shows himself, and then he stabs Han Solo, which I believe with the help of Han Solo, which I do buy into that fan theory. It's just like that his whole arc was, in that moment, he was kind of broken. He was kind of defeated. He wasn't understanding of his place and his full potential and going with just being himself, so he was hiding behind the mask. And then in episode 8, in this movie, he breaks it. He is shattered as a person because he's conflicted, fully conflicted. He thought killing Han was going to help him, but it doesn't. It just fully breaks him apart. Breaks him apart more than what he was in that movie. So he breaks his mask out of anger, even though like that whole sequence with Snoke happened. So it's just, this movie gets a bad rap because of moments that people just aren't touching on. The symbolism, like George Lucas says, this is poetry. It's meant to rhyme. Things are supposed to tell you what's coming and almost show you exactly what's gonna happen. And you can even look on the previous movies that this is the same thing. These movies are meant to rhyme. They're meant to be similar. They're meant to tell the same story arc in a way, but in a different manner, because everything is the same. Boom Boy doesn't need to be big Boom Boy. He wasn't a big major factor in this movie, and he didn't need to be. He just shows that there's hope, is what his whole thing was, is that there is hope for the future, and that there might be a future Jedi Order and stuff like that. So I don't think that we needed to really bash this movie. I don't think that this movie needs to be shunned as much as it is. Rise of Skywalker does vindicate it in a lot of ways. I think Luke's whole story arc in this movie is really shown from the beginning and justified in the end, because whenever he flips his lightsaber over his shoulder, he is done with the Jedi. He doesn't care about the Jedi. He doesn't care about the Force. He is done. He's ready to move on. So he getting this lightsaber, just like, forget it. It wasn't an insult necessarily to the whole Star Wars and thing like that. It was more of him just not caring about the Jedi anymore. So he didn't need this, so he threw it over his shoulder and just kept moving. And then at the end, whenever he finally comes back into the Force and he justifies himself as that hero that he needed to be, making that sacrifice for everyone to leave and make it out safely. One last thing before because it just popped in my head and I really want to touch on it, is people in the next movie were kind of not understanding why Rey and Finn were connected mentally in that movie, which, spoiler alert, they are. But you see it at the end, even after Snoke is killed in that movie, or in this movie. At the end, whenever Kylo Ren has the dice from Han Solo, he can still see Rey. It is still implied that they see each other. They're might not be talking, but it's still implied that they're talking, so that link is still there. And you also see that he the beginning, it's kind of weird because they couldn't touch, they couldn't do anything. She shoots, but he doesn't hurt him. And the second time they talk, he gets wet from the waves. And the third time, he just feels, he's actually kind of there. He sees Luke. They can touch. So the evolution of what it does in Episode 9 is justified in this movie. So I don't see why people hate on this movie. I liked it. I wouldn't give it a 10 out of 10, not necessarily. I'd probably give it about a 6, maybe a 7 out of 10. But that's just me. I do hope that this tries to bring into light what, like, not justifying the hate, but kind of washing it away and trying to let you fully embrace this movie. I will be back in about another hour with my talk about Episode 9 and then the last 2 videos, so I do hope you come back. See you in a little bit.